In the early 1740s, Thomas Grippus landed in the United States, or what would be the United States, in the area that would be Connecticut. He developed a land because he thought it was fertile soil. He thought it was a great place to build a small town, and he began to settle the region. By 1750s, it was predominantly run by a group of people belonging to the Dudley family. Though it was really called Aylesbury and essentially was kind of a of-the-day suburb of Cornwall, it became known as Dudleytown. And in Dudleytown, things thrived. Things went very well. An iron industry erupted from the region. People were doing very well. And then something happened. In the 1840s, 1850s, the community began to shrink and shrivel. By the 1920s, it was a ghost town, empty. To this day, it is empty. Now it is on private property, and one cannot visit there. Not that one would, because as local legend has it, the town of Dudleytown is haunted, patrolled by malevolent, violent, terrifying spirits. Perhaps land that is cursed because of the ancestor Dudleys. No one will live there. No one would want to live there, because Dudleytown, Connecticut is considered one of the most haunted ghost towns in all of the United States, perhaps even the entire world. Is Dudleytown truly haunted? Or was it just economics that led to the demise of the town, to one after another, its citizens vanishing into the world? Whatever the case may be, Dudleytown stands empty, and a great mystery for us to look at today on Urban Legends Unmasked. I'm your host, Chad Lehrman. I, for one, am fascinated by ghost towns. I absolutely love the idea of haunted towns, of abandoned cities. I recently read a book by an indie author, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Boris Bacik, called Suicide Town, which basically kind of plays into this sort of legend. A really good book, great thriller. You might want to check that out. It's on Amazon. But I also I love the idea of that places can be haunted. You know, last week we talked about Riverdale Road in Colorado and this multitude of things that seem to occur along this road that made it a haunted, dark place to go. Dudleytown is a different story. Dudleytown is not so much this unfortunate place where bad thing after bad thing after bad thing happened. It's a place where one big thing happened. A town essentially disappeared. Now, as I mentioned, I think that there is something to be said in literature that we have a lot of stories about haunted towns and places that have this darkness to them. It is this amazing book by Stephen King. There are parts that definitely are creepy for reasons other than the horror, but there are parts of this book that just really nail home this idea of a corrupt, of a possessed town. I don't think that Pennywise is the real villain of the story. I mean, yes, he is the villain of the story, but to me, it's Derry. Derry, Maine is the character. It is this haunted place. Is it haunted because Pennywise is there, or was there a darkness that was always in this place? And I think that's really, for me as a reader and as a fan of that book, that's the question I want to ask, are there places in this world that draw darkness, that draw evil and wickedness? And again, I like to look at these legends and go, they're not real. Nothing really happens there. These things are false. These are just our active imaginations. And maybe that's what it is. As I was researching Connecticut and trying to find what legend I wanted to do, I found a couple that were pretty interesting. But this one, the more I read about Dudleytown, the more I thought this is prime, because there's a lot of aspects to this that lend itself to not just the idea of a scary story, of a haunting, but also to the urban legend, the idea of stay away from my property. Again, I mentioned that Dudleytown is on private property now. People own this. Like, you're not really allowed to go out there and just hang out and check this thing out. Apparently you can get permission to go out there, but they're very reluctant to give that. Understandably so. I don't think I'd want people traipsing around my property wanting to ghost hunt. That might get a little bit old. So the point is that maybe right off on the outset, perhaps the legends of this place being haunted and terrifying are formulated by the owners of the property wanting you to stay away. However, we know that sometimes there's more to the story than just what the eye can see. And on the outset of this being really and truly a haunted location, I want us to look at that. I want us to look at kind of the legend behind that, where it comes from. And the legend really starts a long, long time ago. The rumor is that Edmund Dudley, this English nobleman in the time of Henry VIII, had actually conspired against the king, tried to overthrow him. He was caught, he was beheaded, executed, and that would have been the end of the story, except that there are some legends or some lore that indicates that a curse was placed upon the Dudley family, that wherever they go, because they tried to kill Henry VIII, they would find a curse. They would find death. They would find failure. They would find a life of being destitute, that things would never go well for the Dudleys. And so they fled England, according to this lore, and they settled here in the United States. And they believed that those who settled in Aylesbury or Cornwall, that sort of created Dudleytown, that these Dudleys were in fact descendants of that very Edmund Dudley, and therefore they brought the curse with them. So we got this sort of blood curse thing going here. We got this idea that in the New England region of the United States, a blood curse from the 1500s has survived generation after generation. Now, with that being said, what do people report? What do people say they see in Dudleytown? There are orbs. It seems to be always the case in this. There are these little blue lights or little white lights, these little circles that float around through the air, and people claim to see those things. But watching this, I was watching a video on one particular website, I believe it was in Things in Your State, that basically this guy is talking about what happened, like what went on in Dudleytown when they did get permission to go out there. And he described a feeling of oppression. He described this feeling of a weight of evil, of something that just seemed to be crushing you, this get out feeling that you have. And I mentioned before, I believe that there are places that give off that vibe. I mean, walk into a haunted house, you know you're coming in there, but there's an automatic sort of sense that something's there. And I believe that can be psychologically placed in us. Like, you prime yourself for it. You prepare yourself to go into a situation and you're like, I'm going to get scared. I want to be scared. And even if your mindset is, I'm going to try not to get freaked out, you're sort of, in your brain, you're kicking yourself into gear. You're causing your adrenaline to start to perhaps like think about bumping itself up, to really try to get amped up. So in your attempt to not get excited or get fearful, you're creating an atmosphere and an environment where you will be absolutely terrified. So that being the case, you go to Dudleytown and you're, wanting to see what you can out there to see if this is really all that crazy and creepy. And I don't know, maybe you want to see something, and you do. And so that creates that feeling. So that's kind of a divergent look at it, but I do believe that there are places that give us these feelings, but it may not be the place, it may be just ourselves. Like, we amp ourselves up for these things. So Dudleytown, like the question is did Dudleytown truly become a ghost town because of a curse, of a spiritual curse? So we're going to start by really looking at first the not quite supernatural way of addressing this. And that is that, as I mentioned in the intro, Dudleytown became not just a place, a farming community, but there was also an iron industry that developed there. And as you know, due to the development of steel and the Industrial Revolution, iron began to kind of wane. Its influence and its power in the world began to become less and less, being replaced by the superior metal of steel, arguably superior metal of steel. And so when that began to happen, iron industry began to dry up, okay? So that's one of the theories, that perhaps the people left because iron wasn't working anymore. The other thing is that despite the original founder, Thomas Griffiths, thinking this was a great place to raise crops, it wasn't so much. Like, people were finding it to be difficult to grow things. And one of those reasons might be that it was pretty far from an actual water source. It wasn't really close. If you go back to the historical times of 15, 16, 1700s, and the establishment, especially here in the Americas, of European civilizations, European settlements, what you find is that they would often place themselves next to lakes or rivers because you needed to have water sources. The further you got from the water source, the more difficult it was for you to quite frankly, survive if you didn't have access to water. One of the most basic human needs that we have. You don't got water, you don't make it. That's just the way things work. And so with that being said, I feel like it's very, very plausible and possible that there is a completely non-supernatural, normal reason for why Dudleytown became a ghost town. And it wouldn't be all that different from the reasons why when you drive out west, you begin to see ghost towns scattered in the mountains and in the deserts and in the some areas of California. There were moments where those communities met a need, and then that need disappeared and it was gone. I'm gonna give you another example. Like in Colorado, there's a number of these ghost towns that are there because of mining. One of the ones that I remember going to a number of years back is known as Animus Forks. It's actually in the San Juan Mountains. A couple episodes back, we talked about Alfred Packer and the San Juan Mountains. Animus Forks is very, very near that. And Animus Forks is a collection of cedar or wooden buildings at, probably around 10,000 feet elevation, very, very high up in the mountains. Very hard to get to if you're coming from the Lake City side. You can also access it via Ouray. But yeah, it was a mining community. And when the mining dried up, when the silver stopped flowing, so did the people coming to the community. And so Dudleytown is probably that. It's probably just that it left. And perhaps the people in the surrounding area wanted a reason or a rationale for why that happened. And I don't know, maybe they weren't willing to admit that the economy was really bad, that their livelihood of iron making and iron smelting wasn't making the bread no more, if you will. And so maybe they just wanted to say, well, maybe the people of Dudleytown left because it was haunted. Because one way or another, people in the 1800s were a little bit more superstitious than we are. Keep in mind, this is a town that was founded in the 1700s. We're not that far from a rash of like witch trials, like things where people are accusing of the others of being involved in the supernatural and the occult and all these bad things. And so perhaps people were just like, maybe they brought this on themselves by meddling in the dark arts. Maybe that's their way of responding to that. And again, when the legend of why this occurred, maybe we started having this darker legend much more recently. Maybe it was sort of a whispered thing in the 1800s of why people were leaving, but by the time it was really gone in the 1920s, maybe it's just not whispered. Maybe it's shouted from the rooftops, if you will. So is this a truly haunted place? There are definitely a large number of people who think it is. There are a large number of people who think that this place is problematic, that it is definitely a place of darkness. It's also considered a place of silence. Those who have traveled out to the region say that it is eerily quiet, that you don't find a lot of animals around, you don't find a lot of the typical forest noise that you might hear, the chirp of birds or the squeak of a squirrel or whatever noise a fox makes. Those kind of things aren't really present in that particular region. Now, one of the other reasons why Dudleytown has sort of gained prominence is something that happened in the 1970s. That infamous family, the Warrens, made famous by the Conjuring series, they declared it to be demonically possessed, that the region, that Dudleytown was in fact in the hellacious grips of a demonic presence. And of course that becomes, big reason why people want to see this place, right? I mean, it's like terrifying. It's a scary place. I want to be scared. And that seems to be a recurring theme that we've talked about, is that people want to be afraid. They want to be terrified. And so with that being said, the Warrens made this declaration. However, it was debunked that there was any sort of curse or there is anything dark going on by an actual descendant of the actual Dudleys who really started this place. Now, In addition to this Dudley, a Reverend Gary P. Dudley, according to moneyinc.com, this Gary Dudley says, hey, I don't have any curses on me. I'm doing just fine. And none of this is true. Okay. It's just basically the town fell apart because we didn't plan well. Okay. My ancestors did a terrible job of that. Okay. So he's debunking that. Where a conspiracy theorist would say, of course he would. That's what he wants you to think. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Gary P. Dudley, Reverend Gary P. Dudley, sounds like a wonderful man, probably not lying at all about this situation. Now, that's not going to stop people from going to check this out. And just because this particular person says, no, there wasn't any sort of curse, there's nothing going on, doesn't mean that there's not something strange going on here. And I think that's going to be what draws people, what brings people back, keeps them coming back to check out Dudleytown and other towns like it. And that's kind of where I want to go into the sort of sociological, historical background on this, because ghost towns, I think, are interesting to us because it's such a unique phenomenon to see what was once a thriving location completely empty and bare. And especially those ghost towns, again, like what you would see at Chernobyl. Say you went over to Ukraine today and you got a chance to go see Chernobyl, you get this sort of time capsule of what a city in 1986 Pripyat would have looked like, what that place would have been, the eeriness of children's books open on desks as though they were in the middle of a lesson, because they were when they exited. To see those kind of things, that's something that I think it's eerie because it's almost like a life in still. It's this idea that we see how quickly things can change, how fast what we trust and what we know and what is our solid foundation can slip away from us. And ghost towns are sort of stories that tell that. I mentioned Animus Forks, Colorado. This is a place where, there's not like you see a lot of stuff there. I mean, it's been vacant for over 100 years now. So most of the knickknacks and stuff that were there might have disappeared. But, periodically they still say people find things, buttons off of shirts, or perhaps a part of a brooch from one of the prostitutes that live there in Animus Forks. And I would imagine the same thing could be said for your Dudley towns. These locations that if people did truly leave quickly, then they left remnants of themselves, remnants of a life long gone, of history, living history. And I think it's another reason why we find fascination in stories like the Jamestown colony, the Roanoke colony. The idea that here are these folks that set up a life and then they just disappeared. And I'm not sure we'll get to Roanoke. I think that'll probably pop up at some point, so I don't want to go too much into that one. But Roanoke is just that's an interesting story. We are fascinated by stories that don't have an ending, if you will. The stories where we don't really know what happened. Our brains love to fill in those gaps. And again, that psychological concept of closure doesn't just apply to when I look at a cloud, I see a bunny. It applies to filling in the gaps in narratives and stories. It's why we want to make sense of things like the Kennedy assassination. It's why we want to believe that there's more to just Lee Harvey Oswald taking a shot at the president. We want to believe that there is more to the story of, what happens in the Bermuda Triangle, rather than just planes crash there. Like it's a big body of water and things happen in that region. We want to believe there's more to that. We want to believe, in some cases, the things that are unnatural or supernatural, if you will, that these kind of things are happening because the mundane, basic answers just seem too easy for us. Our brains, I think, want deeper answers. I think there's something in us that is calling for there to be more than what we can see and experience. And that's exciting. And I think that's really where we're coming to on these things, is that we go to Dudleytown because Dudleytown doesn't resolve. There's a great book, a memoir by a man named Donald Miller from a number of years ago called Blue Like Jazz. And in it, it's a religion book, and he's kind of talking about his faith and his belief. And he says he believes that God is kind of like jazz because jazz doesn't resolve. I'll take it a little broader, and I'll say that I think that reality is kind of like jazz. It doesn't resolve. There aren't always simple solutions and answers to these stories. And sometimes when we get a simple answer, like, hey, the iron just ain't selling like it used to, folks, so we're going to take off down the road. When that's too basic or too mundane, I think sometimes we want things to not resolve. We want there to be a deeper meaning behind it. That civilizations don't just die because we run out of money. And maybe it's not that it's too mundane, maybe it's that it hits too close to home. That we perhaps are fearful that it could all go away tomorrow. That I may be a millionaire, but if all my money's in stocks and the market crashes, I'm broke. I'm a walking ghost town. And that perhaps terrifies us. And so maybe we're drawn to these ghost towns like Dudleytown because we identify. We fearfully identify that perhaps things aren't always going to go our way. That scares me. That's something that terrifies me as a human being, not knowing what comes next. You know, what if tomorrow lightning strikes my house and it burns down and I lose everything? You know, what if my job goes away? What if? And ghost towns are the great what ifs. What if they had moved a little closer to the water? What if iron hadn't been replaced by steel? What if, they'd found gold? What if things had been different? And so Dudleytown will draw us because maybe it's haunted. Probably not, but maybe it's haunted. Dudleytown will draw us because we're being told you can't go there anymore. That's another big thing. I think that when you put up a fence around a ghost town and say, nope, can't go there, it makes people go, wait, why don't you want me there? The simple answer is it's private property. I don't want you traipsing around on my property. But we always want to see more, right? We always want to believe that they're trying to keep something from us. They're trying to hide the truth. Be honest, I'm curious. I'd love to see what Dudleytown looks like. I'd love to slip under the cover of night and go out there and see what the place looks like, which is another factor too. Any of the people who have said that they've been out to Dudleytown, they go at night because they don't want to be seen. And it's creepy in the dark. Like, I don't care. I'm 42 years old. I get scared of the dark sometimes. Like, you don't know what's out there. Stub a toe. Get eaten by a monster. You never know. That stuff's out there. Anyway, Dudleytown, probably not haunted, but definitely a place that if you get a chance to go and, stand on the perimeter and look into the dark, stare into the abyss, let it stare back at you, probably a great place to go. Get a nice little horror thrill by checking out this supposedly poltergeist or demonically infested place. Or any number of other ghost towns that we may or may not get to on Urban Legends Unmasked. In the meantime, as always, feel free to check out some of the books I've written: Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, Beneath These Brittle Bones, Kill Town, probably being the most in line with what we talk about here, talking about local legends and terrifying specters and serial killer type monster figures and those things. So definitely check those books out if you can. But until then, next time, I hope you've enjoyed our first foray into the East Coast of Urban Legends in America. And we'll be back next time to talk a few more on Urban Legends Unmasked. I'm your host, Chad Lehrman.